So, what if the way you view the world isn't just, slightly biased, but actively and structurally manufactured?
Right.
What if the reality you perceive through the news, your understanding of history, and even the vocabulary you use to describe your own life is shaped by this highly complex system designed specifically to keep you isolated?
It's a heavy thought.
It really is. And perhaps most importantly, what if the ultimate defense against this massive system of control isn't something you have to learn in a classroom, but something that's actually hardwired into your very biology?
Yeah, that's the real twist here.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are thrilled to have you with us today as we embark on a mission to unpack a really massive, sweeping collection of work by the renowned linguist and political analyst Chomsky. Our goal for this session is to explore exactly how power operates, how information is controlled, and what human nature tells us about our innate capacity for freedom.
And it is a massive undertaking, but I think it's a vital one. We're looking at decades of analysis that spans, political science, media critique, history, linguistics, and even cognitive psychology.
Yeah, it covers a lot of ground.
It really does. By pulling these different threads together, we can start to see a very clear, if deeply unsettling picture of how modern societies function
Mm.
and how consent is essentially engineered from the top down.
Okay, so before we get completely lost in all this, I do want to set a quick ground rule for you, our listeners. Today, we are looking at some incredibly massive and, frankly, often controversial frameworks.
Definitely.
And just a quick heads up as we get into this, Chomsky pulls absolutely no punches when critiquing United States foreign policy, capitalism, the mainstream media, and international relations.
He does not. He is looking very critically at state and corporate power.
Right. So our goal today isn't to take a side or, agree or disagree with his politics. We are not endorsing these viewpoints, and we're not condemning them either. We are just here to act as your tour guides through the architecture of his arguments, so you can see exactly how he believes the system of control operates. We just want to understand the mechanics of his theories.
Exactly. The value of this conversation lies in understanding how this specific lens of analysis works. It forces us to question the basic assumptions of our daily information diet.
Right.
It gives us a framework to look at the news, not as a direct reflection of reality, but as a product.
Yeah.
A product created by specific institutions with very specific interests.
So let's start right there with the news. Because we are told constantly from the time we are in grade school that we have a free press.
Right, the watchdog.
Yeah, this independent media that acts as a neutral arbiter of truth, standing up to power and telling us what's actually going on in the world. But Chomsky introduces a completely different framework, which he calls the propaganda model. And I have to admit, when I first heard that term, propaganda model, I immediately pictured, a shadowy room full of executives smoking cigars, manually redlining articles, and actively plotting to lie to the public. But that's not what he's saying at all, is it?
No, not at all. And that's a really crucial distinction to make right up front. The propaganda model doesn't rely on a conscious conspiracy.
Okay.
It's what we call an institutional analysis.
Okay.
So it argues that the mainstream media functions to propagandize on behalf of powerful societal interests simply because the media itself is a massive corporate institution.
Right, it's just doing business.
Exactly. It's constrained by very specific, undeniable structural factors.
Right.
And these factors act as filters. If you imagine raw reality as a stream of water, it has to pass through these heavily designed filters before it reaches your screen or your newspaper.
Only news that makes it through the filters reaches you. Okay, I want to break down exactly how these filters work. Because if there isn't a smoky back room of executives manually censoring the news, what actually is the mechanism? How does a story about, say, corporate malfeasance actually get killed or softened before it reaches my screen? What is the first filter?
The first filter is ownership. We have to look at who actually owns the media. We aren't talking about small-town independent newspapers run by a local family anymore.
Right.
We're talking about the massive centralization of media into a shrinking number of transnational conglomerates. If you look at the trajectory over the last few decades, it's pretty staggering. Back in the early 1980s, you had around 50 giant firms dominating the mass media landscape.
Which already sounds pretty small for a whole country.
Yeah, but then less than a decade later, that number shrank to 23.
And today it feels like it's even fewer.
It is. Eventually, you end up with just a handful of massive transnational behemoths. Companies that own the news networks, the movie studios, the publishing houses, even the amusement parks.
These are pop cultural and corporate giants.
Exactly. And because they are massive, publicly traded corporations, their primary orientation is the bottom line. I mean, their legal fiduciary duty is to generate profit for their shareholders.
Right.
So they are deeply integrated into the market system, heavily invested in the status quo, and increasingly, they prioritize entertainment over serious public sphere journalism.
Because serious investigative journalism is really expensive, and entertainment is cheap to produce and highly profitable.
Yes.
Plus, entertainment creates a distracted audience, which leads perfectly into the second filter, which is advertising. Now, I have to say, this was a huge paradigm shift for me.
Yeah.
Because I always thought that when I bought a newspaper or, paid for cable subscription, I was the customer and the news was the product I was buying. But Chomsky completely flips that, doesn't he?
He completely flips it. The media doesn't sell news to audiences. It sells audiences to advertisers.
Let's slow down on that because it is so fundamental. You're saying, I am not the customer, I am the product being sold.
Precisely. If a newspaper costs, say, $1 to physically print and distribute, but they sell it at the newsstand for 50 cents, they are losing money on the physical object.
Right.
The only way they survive, the only way they make a profit is through advertising revenue. So if your revenue comes almost entirely from advertisers, who is your real client? Who do you actually have to please?
It's not the reader or the viewer.
No, it's the advertisers. They're funding the entire enterprise.
So how does that filter the news? It's not like the CEO of a car company calls up the news desk and says, hey, don't run that story, or do they?
I mean, sometimes they do, but usually it's much more subtle and structural.
Yeah.
The media must create an environment that is conducive to selling goods.
Okay.
Imagine you are a television executive. You have a prime time slot, and your primary sponsor is a massive chemical company or a major bank. You do not want to broadcast a deeply unsettling investigative documentary about corporate pollution or financial fraud right before cutting to a commercial for that exact corporation, or even a similar corporation.
Right, because the viewer is going to be angry or depressed.
Exactly. Advertisers explicitly state that they want programming that cultivates a buying mood.
A buying mood.
Yeah. They want light, entertaining, non-controversial content that leaves the viewer receptive to purchasing lifestyle products. If a news division consistently runs hard-hitting, anti-corporate stories, the advertisers will simply pull their funding and move to a more compliant network.
Wow.
So the media structurally marginalizes critical dissenting voices that might upset the sponsors. They don't have to be explicitly told to do it. It's just basic survival in an advertising-driven market.
That makes terrifying sense. So we have mega corporations owning the news, and they are selling us, the audience, to other mega corporations. Which brings us to the third filter, sourcing. Let's talk about the actual mechanics of a newsroom. Where does the news actually come from on a day-to-day basis?
Well, a lot of people imagine investigative reporters out on the streets, digging through trash cans, meeting confidential informants in dark parking garages.
Well, like all the president's men.
Yeah, exactly. And while that exists, it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the news. The vast majority of daily news relies heavily on what are called primary definers.
Primary definers, who are they?
These are government agencies, the Pentagon, the White House press office, police departments, and corporate public relations departments.
Okay.
Think about it from the perspective of a newsroom manager. You have a 24-hour news cycle to fill, and you have a heavily reduced budget because of the profit motives we just talked about. You need a steady, cheap, and easily accessible flow of information.
And the government and corporate PR teams are more than happy to provide that.
They provide it beautifully packaged. They hold press conferences at convenient times. They provide advanced copies of speeches. They hand out glossy press packets with pre-written quotes. They offer photo opportunities.
Just making the journalist's job as easy as possible.
Exactly. Chomsky points out a staggering statistic regarding the disparity here. There are tens of thousands more public relations agents actively working to doctor and frame the news than there are journalists actually writing it.
Wait, really? Tens of thousands more?
Yes. So it's an arms race.
Yep.
And the journalists are massively outnumbered.
And outspent, I'm sure.
And outspent. The PR industry spends billions of dollars to shape the narrative. The media relies on these subsidies of information because genuine investigative journalism is expensive, time-consuming, and legally risky.
Right.
When you depend almost entirely on the PR industry and government briefings for your daily copy, you inherently adopt their framing of reality. If the Pentagon says we launched a surgical strike today, the news reports Pentagon launches surgical strike. They don't independently verify if it was actually surgical or if it, hit a hospital. The framing is baked in at the source.
Okay, so we've got ownership, advertising, sourcing, and
Yes.
wrapping all of this together like a tight bow is the fourth filter, which is ideology.
Yes.
Chomsky refers to this as the unquestioned religion of market populism. Can you explain how ideology acts as a filter? Because in America, we pride ourselves in having open debate. You turn on the TV and people are yelling at each other all the time. It really looks like a fierce debate.
It looks like a fierce debate, but if you look closely, that debate takes place within a very narrow, rigidly enforced spectrum.
How so?
Ideology is the boundary of acceptable thought. The unquestioned religion of market populism is the absolute assumption that free markets are inherently benevolent, that they are the only rational and realistic way to organize a human society,
Right.
and that any non-market option, like any collective or public approach, is immediately suspect, inefficient, or dangerous.
So it sets the limits of the conversation before it even starts.
Precisely. You can debate how to implement market policies. You can have a very loud, very angry debate on television about whether a specific defense budget should be increased by 3% or decreased by 2%.
Sure.
You can debate which corporate tax loophole to tweak. But the fundamental premise is that corporate globalization is inherently good, that a massive global military apparatus is fundamentally necessary, that healthcare should be tied to private profit. Those underlying assumptions are completely off limits for serious mainstream debate.
And if you bring them up?
If you question those premises, you aren't debated. You're simply dismissed as radical, unserious, or fringe. The filter of ideology ensures that only variations of the status quo are presented to the public as viable options.
I think the best way to visualize all these filters working together is to think of the media like a funhouse mirror.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, like when you walk into a funhouse and look at a mirror, it doesn't usually invent objects out of thin air. It reflects what is actually standing in front of it, but it stretches the reflection, it shrinks certain parts, and it distorts the image so severely based on the shape of the glass.
Right.
And in this case, the shape of the glass is dictated by who owns the mirror, who pays the advertising dollars to keep the mirror clean, who supplies the lighting through press releases, and the ideological frame holding the mirror up. By the time the image reaches your eyes, the original reality is completely unrecognizable.
That is a highly accurate analogy. I mean, the raw facts might be present in the reporting. They aren't necessarily making things up out of whole cloth.
Yeah.
But the context, the placement of the story, is it on page 1 or buried on page 17? The tone, the emotional emphasis, and the historical background are entirely warped to serve the structural interests of the mirror's owners.
Okay, so if this propaganda model is correct, if the media is this distorted funhouse mirror, we need to test it. What exactly does it choose to magnify, and what does it shrink into oblivion?
Let's test it.
How does this apply to real human lives and international events? This takes us to what I found to be the most chilling and honestly undeniable concept in all of Chomsky's analysis: the double standard of worthy versus unworthy victims.
This is where the propaganda model is rigorously tested against empirical reality. Because if the media truly is a neutral arbiter of truth, it should value all human life equally.
Right. A tragedy is a tragedy.
It's exactly. A victim of a human rights abuse should receive the same coverage regardless of who committed the abuse. But Chomsky's theory posits the exact opposite. He argues that victims of enemy states are treated by the media as worthy of massive indignation, front-page coverage, and deep humanization.
And the unworthy victims.
Meanwhile, victims of the United States or its client states are deemed unworthy. Their suffering is structurally ignored, downplayed, or rationalized away.
The case studies he provides to prove this are just staggering. Like, you can actually test this double standard by looking at how the media treats almost identical crimes. Let's look at the assassination of religious figures during the Cold War. Chomsky contrasts the media coverage of Jerzy Popieluszko with the coverage of Archbishop Oscar Romero. Let's lay out the history here. Who was Jerzy Popieluszko?
Jerzy Popieluszko was a Catholic priest in Poland. In 1984, he was brutally murdered by the Internal Intelligence Agency of the Communist Government of Poland.
Okay.
Now, geopolitically, Poland at the time was part of the Soviet bloc. It was an official enemy state of the United States.
Got it. And who was Archbishop Oscar Romero?
Archbishop Oscar Romero was the preeminent Catholic authority in El Salvador. Throughout the late 1970s, El Salvador was ruled by a brutal, right-wing military dictatorship that was heavily backed, funded, and armed by the United States.
Right.
Romero became a fierce critic of the regime. He spoke out against the poverty, the death squads, and the human rights abuses. He famously wrote a letter to President Jimmy Carter pleading with the U.S. to stop sending military aid to the Salvadoran government because it was being used to massacre the people.
And what happened to him?
In 1980, while he was literally standing at the altar giving mass, Archbishop Romero was assassinated by a right-wing death squad aligned with the U.S.-backed government.
So you have two prominent Catholic figures, both speaking out against oppressive regimes, both brutally assassinated just a few years apart. By any objective standard of journalism, these are equally horrific, equally newsworthy events. How did the media coverage compare?
The coverage was night and day. Populusco's death in Poland was a massive, sustained media event in the West. His murder was featured on front pages for weeks. Reporters dug deep into his life, interviewing his grieving congregation, detailing his heroism.
He really humanized him.
Deeply. His death was explicitly used by politicians and the media to demonstrate the inherent, irredeemable evil of the Soviet communist system. It was proof of their barbarity.
And Romero, the archbishop.
Romero's death, despite his immense prominence, he was an archbishop, a global figure nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. His death was treated as a tragic but confusing incident in a chaotic country. It was barely a blip by comparison.
Wow.
There was no deep humanization of his congregation, no sustained investigative outrage. In fact, Chomsky notes an unbelievable metric. Populusco received more media coverage than Romero and 100 other religious figures murdered in Latin America by U.S.-backed states combined.
Wait, 100 other religious figures?
Yes. The violence in U.S.-backed client states in Latin America heavily targeted religious workers who advocated for the poor. This actually included American citizens. In 1980, 4 American churchwomen, 3 nuns, and a lay missionary were raped and murdered by the U.S.-backed National Guard in El Salvador.
American citizens, American nuns, raped and murdered by a government the U.S. was funding. You would think that would be the biggest scandal of the decade.
You really would think so. But the outrage was incredibly muted. The details were sanitized. High-ranking U.S. officials even tried to suggest the nuns were somehow at fault, implying they were aiding subversives. And the media largely allowed that framing to stand without massive pushback.
Why? Why is the funhouse mirror so distorted here?
Because outrage over Populusco served the structural interests of state power. It demonized an official enemy, which justified the Cold War military budget. Outrage over Archbishop Romero or the American nuns would have raised incredibly uncomfortable questions. It would force the American public to ask, why are our tax dollars funding death squads? Why are we arming the people who murdered an archbishop?
Yeah, you can't ask that on the evening news.
Exactly. The victims in El Salvador were structurally unworthy of the media's tears because acknowledging their humanity would undermine U.S. foreign policy.
We see this exact same double standard with what is arguably the most powerful, emotionally charged word in the international lexicon: genocide.
Yeah.
Chomsky shows how this term is not used objectively based on legal definitions, but is highly politicized based on who is doing the killing.
Chomsky tracks the mainstream media's usage of the word genocide across different international conflicts, particularly in the 1990s. When analyzing the atrocities committed by enemy states, for example, Saddam Hussein's brutal campaigns against the Kurds in Iraq, or the actions of the Serbs in Kosovo, the word genocide was used hundreds and hundreds of times in major newspapers and broadcasts. The media echoed official government denunciations, generating massive, righteous public outrage that ultimately mobilized support for military intervention.
But then Chomsky pivots and asks us to look at what was happening with U.S. allies at the exact same time. Let's talk about Turkey and Indonesia.
Right. So in the 1990s, Turkey, which is a NATO ally and was receiving massive amounts of U.S. military aid and weaponry, was conducting a devastating counterinsurgency campaign against its own Kurdish population in the southeast. They destroyed thousands of villages and displaced millions of people. At the same time, Indonesia, another crucial U.S. ally, was occupying East Timor. The Indonesian military, led by the dictator Suharto, had illegally invaded East Timor in 1975 with the green light and weapons from the U.S.
And what happened there?
By the 1990s, they had massacred an enormous percentage of the East Timorese population.
Let's be really clear about the scale here. The civilian death tolls in these allied atrocities, Turkey and East Timor, were comparable, and in the case of East Timor, vastly greater in terms of proportion of the population than the casualties in Kosovo.
Absolutely. The slaughter in East Timor is considered one of the worst proportional atrocities since the Holocaust. Yet the media almost never applied the word genocide to the actions of Turkey or Indonesia.
What did they call it instead?
When covering Turkey, the media described them as merely repressing a rebellion or conducting counter-terror operations. The weapons used were U.S. weapons, so the violence was sanitized.
And how did they cover East Timor? How do you hide the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people?
You hide it through silence, or through extremely careful passive language. For years, the media largely ignored East Timor. When they did cover it, they often framed it as a chaotic civil war among local factions, completely obscuring the fact that it was an illegal invasion and occupation by a foreign military armed by Washington.
So they were unworthy victims.
Yes, the victims in East Timor and Turkey were unworthy. They did not serve a useful geopolitical purpose. Acknowledging their genocide would mean acknowledging the complicity of the U.S. government in supplying the weapons, so their suffering was minimized.
Okay, I have to push back here just to play devil's advocate, because when I hear this, a part of my brain tries to find a more innocent explanation.
Sure.
Isn't it possible that it's simply harder for Western journalists to get accurate reporting out of allied dictatorships? Like maybe the Indonesian military wouldn't let reporters into East Timor to verify the body counts, whereas it was just easier to get data out of Kosovo. Is it just a logistical problem?
It's a very common defense, and it sounds plausible on the surface. But Chomsky explicitly refutes it using the historical record. It absolutely was not a lack of evidence.
It wasn't.
No. Throughout the occupation of East Timor, alternative press outlets, massive human rights organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, and major international church groups were providing overwhelming, highly credible, meticulously documented evidence of these atrocities.
So the data was there.
They were smuggling out reports, refugee testimonies, and photographs. The information was readily available on the desks of every major news editor in New York and London.
So they had the reports, and they just chose not to print them.
The mainstream media simply chose to ignore it because it conflicted with elite interests. Chomsky contrasts two specific massacres to prove this point: the Rajkak massacre in Kosovo and the Liquica massacre in East Timor.
Okay, lay those out for us.
The Rajkak massacre, committed by Serbs, an enemy state, involved roughly 45 victims. It received massive wall-to-wall front-page coverage in the West and was the inciting incident used to justify the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. Western leaders expressed profound outrage, and the media amplified every word.
And Liquica.
The Liquica church massacre in East Timor, committed by Indonesian-backed militias just a few months later, involved a significantly higher death toll. Potentially up to 200 refugees slaughtered while seeking sanctuary in a church.
200 people in a church.
Yes. Yet the media coverage in the U.S. was a tiny fraction of the size of Rajkak. There were no calls for military intervention, no massive outrage from politicians amplified by news anchors. The victims in Liquica were slaughtered by weapons paid for by Western tax dollars, so they were unworthy of the front page.
That is incredibly dark.
Yeah.
But as we dig deeper into this, there's an example that I found even more horrifying because it deals with the legacy of weapons of mass destruction. Let's talk about chemical warfare, specifically Agent Orange versus Yellow Rain. What is the history of the U.S. using chemical weapons in Vietnam?
During the Vietnam War, the U.S. military engaged in a deliberate, massive campaign of chemical warfare known as Operation Ranch Hand. They dropped an estimated 20 million gallons of toxic herbicides, primarily Agent Orange, over South Vietnam.
And the purpose of this wasn't just to, clear jungle paths, right? It was aimed at the food supply.
Exactly. The explicit policy was to destroy forest cover used by guerrilla fighters, but also to destroy food crops, to starve the insurgency, and force the rural peasant population into U.S.-controlled cities.
Right.
The environmental devastation was apocalyptic. Millions of acres of arable land and dense jungle were fundamentally ruined. But the long-term human cost is the true nightmare. Agent Orange contained dioxin, one of the most toxic chemicals known to humanity.
What were the effects?
The Vietnamese Red Cross estimates that up to 1 million people were disabled or suffer health problems as a result. This includes an estimated 500,000 children born with severe, horrific birth defects in the decades following the war.
500,000 children born with deformities. That is an ongoing multi-generational tragedy. How did the U.S. media cover this?
The media coverage, when it existed, focused almost entirely on the tragic effects of Agent Orange on U.S. veterans who handled the chemicals, which is, of course, a valid and important story.
Of course.
But the Vietnamese victims, the deliberate targeting of the food supply of a peasant society, the 500,000 deformed children, the devastated landscape that massive war crime was, and largely remains, met with profound media silence. It is not framed as a historic crime against humanity.
Now, contrast that silence with the media frenzy over the yellow rain scare in the 1980s. What was yellow rain?
In the early 1980s, the U.S. government, under the Reagan administration, publicly claimed that the Soviet Union and its allies were using a new, horrific, biological or chemical weapon dubbed yellow rain against populations in Cambodia and Laos.
And how did the media react to these claims?
They went into an absolute frenzy. The media generated massive indignation over communist evil. It was front-page news across the country. It was used to justify massive increases in the U.S. defense budget and the resumption of U.S. chemical weapons production. The media unquestioningly acted as a megaphone for the government's claims of an enemy's chemical atrocities.
And what did yellow rain actually turn out to be? Because I remember reading this in the notes and thinking it was a typo.
It wasn't a typo. Yellow rain turned out to be bee feces.
Bee feces.
Yes. Independent scientists eventually investigated the samples and proved conclusively that the yellow spots were naturally occurring droppings from massive swarms of wild honeybees in the jungle, not a Soviet chemical weapon.
That's insane.
The government's claims completely collapsed under scientific scrutiny.
So the media issued massive front-page retractions and apologized for drumming up fear for a weapons budget.
Oh, stop. The retractions were buried quietly on the back pages, if they happened at all. The media had already done its job of generating anti-enemy propaganda and securing the defense budgets.
Right, the damage was done.
Exactly. The mechanism is clear. When the government claims an enemy is using chemical weapons, even if the evidence is literally bee feces, it's a massive story. But the actual massive, heavily documented use of millions of gallons of toxic chemicals by the U.S. in Indochina remains largely in the media's black hole. It's the ultimate proof of the propaganda model.
It's the exact same story with how we label dictators, isn't it? Like, look at how the media covered Pol Pot versus Suharto. Pol Pot, the architect of the Cambodian genocide, was accurately described by the Western media as a blood-soaked monster. They called him another Hitler. Why? Because Cambodia was aligned against U.S. interests at the time. He was an official enemy, so his crimes were broadcast clearly. But Suharto in Indonesia.
Suharto came to power in 1965 through a military coup that was accompanied by the slaughter of an estimated 500,000 to 1 million landless peasants, labor organizers, and suspected communists.
Up to 1 million people.
Yes. The CIA actually provided lists of names to the Indonesian death squads. It was one of the worst mass murders of the 20th century.
And how did the U.S. media and elites refer to Suharto?
They called him a gleam of light in Asia. Major newspapers praised him.
A gleam of light after killing 1 million people.
Yes. Why? Because the people he was slaughtering were leftists, and Suharto immediately opened up the vast natural resources of Indonesia to Western investors and mining corporations.
Wow.
The hypocrisy is not a mistake, it is structural. If a dictator kills your enemies and opens his markets to your corporations, he is a moderate ally. If a dictator kills your friends or closes his markets, he is another Hitler.
Okay, I want to pivot here because everything we've talked about so far has been focused on foreign policy. Dictators, wars, international atrocities. And you, the listener, might be thinking, well, this is awful, but it happens overseas. Does this propaganda model really affect my day-to-day life?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, Chomsky's answer is a resounding yes. This systemic manipulation extends far beyond international news. It seeps directly into our domestic lives, dictating the very words we use to describe our own economy, our workplaces, and our society.
Exactly. The same mechanisms that obscure human rights abuses abroad are used to obscure the concentration of economic power at home. Chomsky provides a severe critique of what is often called neoliberalism, or the Washington Consensus.
Right.
This is the dominant economic paradigm that has ruled the global economy for the last 40 years. At its core, neoliberalism is a project aimed at shifting power away from the democratic public sphere and handing it over to private hands.
And those private hands belong to corporations. Now, we are taught to view corporations as engines of efficiency, right? The lifeblood of the free market, providers of jobs and innovation. But Chomsky analyzes them through a political lens, and he uses a phrase that really stopped me in my tracks. He describes corporations as unaccountable private tyrannies. He calls it corporate totalitarianism.
It is a very strong phrase, but he uses it quite literally, based on their internal structure. Think about how a corporation actually operates on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
Inside a corporation, power flows strictly from the top down.
Like a pyramid.
Exactly.
Hmm.
Orders come from the board of directors and the major shareholders down to the executive managers, down to the middle managers, and finally down to the workers on the floor.
It's a strict hierarchy.
It is the definition of a strict hierarchy. The workers who produce the value and the communities that are affected by the corporation's actions have absolutely no democratic say in the decisions that dictate their lives. Imagine you live in a town where a major factory employs half the population. The board of directors, sitting in a boardroom 1,000 miles away, decides that it would be slightly more profitable to close that factory and move the operations to a country with no labor laws.
The town is devastated. Schools lose funding, local businesses close, people lose their homes.
Exactly. And did the town get to vote on that decision? Did the workers get a ballot?
No.
No. You don't vote on your company's investment strategy or factory relocations. In terms of their internal power dynamic, corporations are essentially totalitarian structures. They are islands of tyranny operating within what is supposedly a democratic society.
So how does neoliberalism play into this?
Neoliberalism, as an ideology, is the process of taking public services, things like healthcare, education, water rights, prisons, and privatizing them. It is the process of handing more and more of society's democratic decision-making power over to these unaccountable totalitarian entities.
But if that's true, if neoliberalism is essentially a project of stripping away democratic power from the average citizen and giving it to corporate boards, why do people accept it? Why don't we see massive, continuous outrage? And this is where the propaganda model comes back into play, right?
Yeah.
To make us accept the surrender of our power, the elite classes have to weaponize language. They have to twist the very vocabulary we use so we can't even formulate the thoughts required to resist.
Yes. The PR industry doesn't just sell products, it sells an entire worldview. And they do it by redefining words. Chomsky gives a brilliant, concrete example of this. The term special interests.
Oh, I love this example because we hear it every single election cycle. When you turn on the news and hear a politician or a pundit talk about special interests, they always use it as a negative, corrupting force. They stand at the podium and say, we have to fight the special interests in Washington. But Chomsky asks us to look closely at who they are actually referring to when they use that phrase. According to his analysis, when elites use the term special interests, who do they mean?
They were referring to women, minorities, labor unions, environmentalists, the elderly seeking pensions, the young seeking affordable education.
Wait, women, minorities, workers, the old and the young. That's everybody.
Exactly. In other words, the vast majority of the general population, the actual living, breathing people of the country, are defined as the special interests.
So if the entire population is a special interest, who isn't a special interest?
Corporate power, the Fortune 500, the banking sector, the military-industrial complex. They are never, ever referred to as a special interest.
Wow.
Through a masterstroke of PR framing, the business community is rebranded as the national interest. What is good for the profit margins of a transnational conglomerate is automatically assumed to be the national interest.
Right, if they want a tax cut, it's for the economy.
Exactly. When they want tax cuts or deregulation, it's for the health of the economy. But when actual human beings ask for living wages, clean water, or health care, their needs are dismissed as the whining of greedy special interests trying to disrupt the natural order.
It completely inverts reality. Up is down. The population is a special interest, and the corporations are the nation. And the ultimate goal of this linguistic manipulation and the broader public relations industry is a concept Chomsky calls atomization.
Atomization is arguably the most crucial concept to understand if you want to know how modern control functions. The objective of elite control is not to put you in a physical prison, it's to keep you isolated in your own mind.
Isolated how?
If people are kept alone, if they are atomized into individual units, they are powerless.
How do they achieve that?
By entirely diverting your attention toward consumerism, lifestyle brands, and mindless entertainment. Think about your own scrolling habits. When was the last time a piece of media encouraged you to go talk to your neighbor about your working conditions, or to join a union, or to attend a city council meeting?
Probably never.
Contrast that with how many thousands of times a day you are encouraged to buy a new product to express your individuality, or to obsess over a celebrity scandal. The system deliberately fosters a depoliticized consumer culture to replace the political public sphere.
So you're just a consumer.
You are trained from birth to view yourself as a consumer, not as an active citizen. If you're kept distracted and alone, you don't organize. You don't discover how power truly operates. You remain passive.
Okay, I have to pause here because this is getting incredibly bleak. If the system is this effective at keeping us isolated, if the funhouse mirror is the only thing we see, if the PR industry controls the very vocabulary we use to think about resistance, and if we are constantly atomized by consumer culture, how is anyone supposed to break out of it?
It's the big question.
Are we just doomed? Are human beings just blank slates, like a computer hard drive completely overwritten by corporate PR? Are we just programmable meat that can be conditioned to accept anything?
That's the essential existential question. If we are completely programmable, then the PR industry has already won, and totalitarianism is inevitable. But to answer whether we are blank slates, Chomsky actually pivots away from politics entirely. We have to leave the realm of political science and media critique and turn to his foundational world-changing work in the hard sciences. We have to look at linguistics and biology.
Because, as it turns out, we are not blank slates.
Not at all. Long before he was known as a political dissident, Chomsky revolutionized the study of linguistics, cognitive science, and psychology. In the 1950s, the dominant theory was behaviorism.
Right, Skinner boxes and all that.
Exactly. The idea that humans are blank slates and we learn everything, including language, simply by mimicking the environment around us through stimulus and reward. Chomsky shattered this. He proved that human beings have a genetically hardwired, species-specific capacity for language.
Meaning we are born with it.
Yes, we are born with a biological framework in our brains, often called universal grammar, that allows us to acquire and use language.
Break down how that works, because the mechanics of a baby learning to talk are actually mind-blowing when you stop to think about it.
Think about the environment an infant is in. It's what linguists call the poverty of the stimulus.
Poverty of the stimulus, meaning the input is poor.
Exactly. The infant is surrounded by chaotic noise. Adults are speaking in incomplete sentences, they say. And they make grammatical errors. They talk over each other. It's a messy, impoverished data set.
Right, they aren't getting proper lessons.
But the infant doesn't just blindly mimic the noise like a parrot. Without any formal instruction, a toddler effortlessly extracts the incredibly complex underlying algebraic rules of syntax and grammar from that chaotic environment.
They build perfect syntactic trees in their minds without ever reading a textbook.
Exactly. And Chomsky points out how universal this is. It happens across all human cultures at roughly the same developmental stages. It happens even pre-birth in some auditory processing stages. And remarkably, it happens identically with sign language for the hearing impaired.
Really? That's amazing.
The biological framework for language functions universally, regardless of whether the modality is spoken word or hand gestures. It proves definitively that the human mind is not a blank slate. It comes preloaded with highly complex, innate cognitive structures. Experience doesn't create the capacity for language. Experience just sets the local variations. It determines whether the innate structure expresses itself as English, Japanese, or Swahili.
Okay, that is fascinating biology, but what does this have to do with political freedom and resisting the propaganda model? Chomsky connects this biological reality back to classical liberal philosophy, specifically looking at the ideas of René Descartes.
Descartes argued that the distinguishing feature of the human mind, the one thing that separates us from a clockwork, automaton, or a non-human animal, is the ability to use language creatively. Think about it. You don't just spit out pre-programmed responses to stimuli. If I say hello, you don't have to say hello back like a machine. You can formulate entirely new thoughts, perfectly appropriate to a novel situation that have never been uttered before in the history of the universe. This infinite creative aspect of language, driven by our innate biology, is the ultimate proof of a free mind.
And here is where Chomsky makes a massive, thrilling extrapolation. If we have an innate, genetically determined biological framework for language, is it possible we have other innate cognitive frameworks, specifically an innate moral framework?
Yes. Chomsky suggests that just as the environmental experience is too impoverished to teach the infinitely complex rules of grammar from scratch, the environment alone is too impoverished to teach us our incredibly complex moral systems.
So we are born with morality.
We likely have an innate, biologically wired moral framework. The environment and our local culture might set the parameters of what is considered polite or taboo in a specific society, but the core, underlying foundation of justice, fairness, empathy, and a desire for freedom is part of our genetic endowment as a species.
Wait, I want to make sure I'm really grasping this because it's a huge claim. Chomsky is suggesting that our sense of justice might be biologically programmed to activate the exact same way puberty is triggered by hormones.
Yes, that is the exact analogy he uses. Just as you don't learn to go through puberty or grow arms, it is a genetically programmed stage of biological maturation triggered by certain environmental conditions and nutrition. Our moral framework is a biologically determined aspect of our cognitive growth. It is part of our nature.
So we aren't infinitely malleable.
We are not. Because we have an innate instinct for freedom, we cannot be perfectly programmed by the PR industry into permanently accepting slavery, exploitation, or totalitarianism without profound underlying psychological friction and eventual rebellion.
That changes everything. It is incredibly hopeful. It means that the massive corporate media conglomerates, the PR agencies, the propagandists, they are ultimately fighting a losing battle against human biology. They can distract us, they can atomize us, but they cannot erase our fundamental nature.
Exactly.
But this leads me to a really frustrating quote. If humans possess this innate biological drive for freedom and rational thought, why do the people who are supposedly the smartest in our society, the intellectuals, the academics, the highly educated experts, why do they often seem so entirely useless when it comes to fighting for justice? Why are they so disconnected from actual grassroots social change?
That is a phenomenal question, and it brings us to one of the most scathing critiques within Chomsky's work. He is remarkably harsh when evaluating academic elites, intellectuals, and particularly certain branches of the humanities. He identifies a phenomenon we can call the trap of theory, intellectual fakery, and the abandonment of true activism.
Yeah, he takes direct aim at the trendy academic movements that dominate universities, things that are often broadly categorized as theory-like, rigid Marxism, Freudianism, or dense postmodernism.
He argues that these are not intellectual disciplines. They are irrational cults. He points out that they function much closer to a theology or a religion than to actual science. Think about the hard sciences. In physics or mathematics, there is no such thing as Planchism or Einsteinism or Newtonism.
Right, you don't worship Newton.
Scientists don't worship a founder as an infallible god. They discover things, they propose theories, they make mistakes, a graduate student proves them wrong a decade later, and the field moves on based on new evidence.
But in the humanities and political theory,
In the humanities, you have these rigid, dogmatic ideologies built entirely around figures like Marx or Freud or Lacan, where the primary goal of the academic isn't to discover new truths about the world, but to interpret and reinterpret the sacred texts of the founder. It becomes a religion.
and the language they use. Anyone who has ever tried to read a postmodern academic paper knows exactly what I'm talking about. The deliberate obfuscation. Intellectuals use these massive multisyllable words like dialectics or epistemological hegemony, an incredibly complex, dense, impenetrable jargon. Why do they do it? According to Chomsky, it's not because the concepts are actually that difficult. It's because if things can be explained in simple monosyllables, if political reality can be understood by a high school student or a factory worker, then the intellectual loses their special elite status.
Exactly. It's entirely about protecting their class privilege. If you are an academic, you need to build a moat around your expertise to justify your position and your salary. Now, quantum physicists have a natural moat because quantum mechanics is genuinely mathematically difficult. It takes years to understand the equations.
Right.
But political reality, who owns the wealth, who drops the bombs, who writes the laws, isn't actually that complicated. The basic dynamics of power are quite simple to grasp. So, to prevent everyone from understanding it, academics invent a convoluted, impenetrable language to make themselves essential as the high priests who translate reality for the masses. It's intellectual fakery designed specifically to exclude the general public.
It's exactly like an artificial dress code at a ridiculously exclusive country club. The complicated language doesn't actually do any real work. It doesn't build a bridge. It doesn't stop a war. It doesn't feed a hungry person. It just exists to ensure that working class people are kept out of the conversation. The academic is essentially saying, you aren't wearing the right vocabulary, you haven't read the right French philosophers, so you aren't allowed to come in here and discuss how the world is run.
That is a brilliant way to phrase it. It's an exclusionary tactic. And it stands in stark contrast to what Chomsky identifies as the genuine, ideal role of the intellectual. He points back to the 1930s as a model, specifically looking at the ideal of popular education.
Right, he mentions a specific book from that era, Mathematics for the Million.
Yes, by Lancelot Hogben. In the 1930s, you had top scientists, leading physicists and mathematicians who felt a profound moral obligation to empower the working class. They didn't want to build moats, they wanted to build bridges. So they wrote accessible, engaging books like Mathematics for the Million, or Science for the Citizens, specifically to demystify complex subjects for everyday people.
Which is amazing.
They took the time to go give talks in union halls to factory workers. True activism, for an intellectual, requires taking complex information about how the world works and making it as clear and accessible to as many people as possible, not hiding it behind a wall of academic jargon.
So if the academics are stuck in their cults, how do the rest of us do the work? What are the actual tools of change today? Naturally, a lot of people point to technology. They point to the internet. And
Yeah.
it's refreshing because Chomsky doesn't fall into the trap of viewing the internet as some magical utopian savior for democracy.
No, he is very pragmatic about it. Technology is rarely inherently good or bad on its own. He compares the internet to a crowbar. A crowbar is a completely neutral tool. You can use it to pull nails and build a house for someone in need, or you can use it to bash someone's head in and break into a bank.
Wow, okay.
It depends entirely on who is holding it and what their intentions are. The internet is the exact same way. It can be an incredible tool for global grassroots solidarity, for bypassing the corporate media filters, and for organizing alternative structures. But it can just as easily be a tool for massive, centralized corporate surveillance, algorithmic manipulation, and the acceleration of commercialized atomization.
So, true activism isn't about waiting for a technological savior to fix the algorithms. And it's certainly not about waiting for a charismatic political leader to save us. It's about doing the unglamorous everyday work. It's about building informal networks of cooperation, talking to your neighbors, creating independent media, forming unions.
It's about relying on that innate human instinct for freedom we discussed, and recognizing that power structures are not invincible natural laws. Every single system of authority, whether it's a transnational corporation, a military-industrial complex, or an academic institution, must justify itself. It has no inherent God-given right to exist or to dominate your life.
And if it cannot justify its authority, which it usually can't, then it is illegitimate and should be dismantled and replaced from the bottom up. And that brings us to the end of this truly massive journey. We've covered an incredible amount of ground today. We've navigated the funhouse mirrors of the media's propaganda model, seeing exactly how structural filters of ownership, advertising, and sourcing warp our reality.
We've looked closely at the empirical evidence, recognizing the brutal structural double standards that make some victims worthy of international outrage and others completely invisible, based purely on the geopolitical needs of the state. We've decoded the atomizing language of neoliberalism, where corporate power hides behind the phrase national interest while dismissing the population as special interests.
But importantly, we've also found profound hope amidst all of this. We discovered through the science of linguistics that we are not blank slates waiting to be programmed. We have a hardwired biological instinct for creative freedom and a moral framework that naturally rejects domination. And we learned that you do not need a PhD, you don't need to master the impenetrable jargon of academic dialectics to understand world affairs or to be a force for change.
The burden of proof is always on authority to justify itself to you. You have the innate biological capacity to understand the world and the moral drive to change it.
But before we let you go, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Something that builds on the frameworks we've discussed today, but points toward a potentially terrifying future.
What's on your mind?
If Chomsky is right, if our moral framework, our sense of justice, and our desire for freedom are truly as biologically innate as our capacity for language, what happens when power structures gain the ability to manipulate our biology directly? Yeah. As neuroscience, pharmacology, and genetic engineering advance at breakneck speeds, could the propaganda model of the future bypass the media entirely? Imagine a world where elites don't need to consolidate ownership of television networks or filter the news because they have the technology to chemically, neurologically, or genetically rewrite our morality instinct at a cellular level.
That is a terrifying thought.
What happens when they can manufacture consent not through a screen but through our synapses? If they can alter the very biology behind our instinct for freedom, will the funhouse mirror finally become the only reality we are physically capable of perceiving? Think about that.